1 year after Panasonic released its GX80, Olympus followed with its counterpart, the EM10 Mark III. This camera is well known for its photography skills, but I would like to take a look at the videography features to see if this camera has the potential to be another 4K pocket cinema camera. This little camera features the same 16 megapixel sensor and overall size as the GX80, and this is why I decided to compare these two cameras against each other in this review, but I think that the body concepts are quite different, but more on that later. The EM10 Mark III can be had nowadays for $350 to $400, which is around half of the price of its own successor, the Mark IV. Other than the newer 20 megapixel sensor, there doesn't seem to be that much of a difference when it comes to the video department. Olympus has one of the best body designs and the EM10 Mark III is no exceptions. I really like the small grip and it lies firmly in my hand. I really like the somewhat retro style, and if you like such body designs you will also love this camera. The only minor complaint I have with the overall design is the position of the neck strap. It's a little bit high up, so it pushes against my fingers here. If I would own this camera, I would probably remove this part, but it's just a very minor complaint. The screen is only a tilting one, so it's not a flip out screen, which would be nice for video shooting, but it's not the end of the world. What I really like on this camera is the viewfinder. It's much better than on the GX80, it's better to see, and it's not near the quality than to the flagship models, but I found myself using it more often outside in bright daylight, and it was a nice experience using this viewfinder. The menu system on this camera is something you need to work a lot with. The learning curve is pretty steep even for someone like me who uses cameras daily, so if you're not an Olympus shooter, you need to work with it a lot. But it all makes sense, and when you wrap your head around it, you can work with it pretty efficiently. The thing that I find to be a bit odd is that I have to switch to this very amateur looking screen when I want to switch resolutions. I know this camera is aimed to consumers, but I find it a little bit off-putting. But the quick menu is very fast to navigate and makes a lot of sense. I really like that. But you have everything on the screen that you need to judge your image, such as a histogram or focus peaking. Also, the button layout makes a lot of sense. You don't have to look for the stuff you need. It's very intuitively laid out in the way it is. Some of the buttons are also customizable to suit your needs, and they all have a very satisfying click to them. Build quality overall is really great. It feels nice and nothing feels cheap or of poor quality. I will keep the I/O short. There is a micro USB that doesn't seem to support charging, and a micro HDMI, which is something I don't really like. I also find the placing on the grip quite poor. Same story as with the GX80. There is also no audio input or headphone jack. The camera can record in UHD from 24 to 30p and in Full HD from 24 to 60p. In the menu you can switch between 24, 25 and 30p, and in the quick menu between either 30 and 60p or 25 and 50p. There is also a slow motion option that lets you shoot 120 frames per second in 720p quality, and a clips option that lets you record 4-second clips and combines them into a short video. That's nothing I would use personally, but maybe someone could find that useful to combine short clips into a reel for their social media. The quality of the video is quite good. It's an H.264 codec and is compressed in 8-bit 420. So, of course it's not 10-bit, but I found the files to be very sturdy and you can push the colors to get your desired look. The good news is that this camera uses the whole width of the sensor to record either full HD or 4K. Some cameras have a crop in 4K because they don't have the processing power to use the full width of the sensor, so that's nice to see. But there is a severe crop when using the MIS1 mode. This camera has two internal image stabilization modes, MIS1 and MIS2. MIS2 is sensor stabilization only, so there is no crop at all, and MIS2 engages another digital crop onto the sensor of a factor of 1.2, which has quite an impact on the width of the image. This is true for both 4K and Full HD. There is also a 1.2 times crop when using the super slow motion. But having the option to have no crop in either Full HD or 4K is great. The GX80, for example, has a 1.1 times crop in 4K with and without image stabilization. The in-body image stabilization of this camera is super effective. The MIS2 mode, which is a sensor stabilization only, works a lot and you get those warpy edges in your images. But when engaging the MIS1 mode and you have that sensor crop in the middle, you get rid of those warpy edges. You can comfortably use this camera handheld in MIS1 mode. I know such effective image stabilization in a small camera can cause some weird movement, but I think it makes sense since when you don't engage the image stabilization, the footage is very shaky. Olympus is known for its great image stabilization, but seeing it firsthand is a great and satisfying experience. When we take a look at sharpness and compare the images in 4K and Full HD from the EM10 Mark III to the GX80, we can see that the M10 seems to be a little over-sharpened and doesn't retain as many true details as the GX80. The problem is that the default sharpness of the M10 is just too much. I would advise to turn the sharpening down to -2 in the picture profile menu to get rid of the digital artificial sharpening that doesn't look that cinematic at all. The unsharpened image of the M10 looks much better than the sharpened one. When we look at true details, the GX80 seem to outperform the M10, but in Full HD I find them very comparable. Honestly, I find the sharpness when the sharpening is turned off quite pleasing. When you want to deliver in HD and convert it down from 4K, you get a nice detailed HD image. And I think that the native Full HD is also quite pleasing to look at. One feature this camera has where it outperforms its Panasonic counterpart is slow motion. Besides its 1080, 50 and 60p mode, this camera can also shoot 120 frames per second in 720p. We have full manual exposure control, which is great, but the image is very soft. It almost looks like an old SD quality from a mini DV camcorder and reminds me a lot of the first implementation of slow motion in older cine camcorders like the FS100. The FS100 would record a 4-second stream and write it onto the card. This camera can record for 20 seconds constantly and write it into a 30p file. I think it's a nice to have feature for the occasional slow motion, but I wouldn't shoot any busy scenes, only details, and the 1080p, 50 and 60 is much better in quality. Maybe for hobby stuff, but nobody would seriously consider the quality of the 720p for a paid gig. The sensor has a decent amount of dynamic range, but there is no flat or log profile. Those are only available in the flagship models from Olympus. The highest dynamic range is in the natural picture profile. It's a decent dynamic range and it has a fairly high contrast. Be sure to not blow out the highlights. You can retrieve a little bit of details from the shadows, but not more than 1 or 2 stops. It's a bit less than the GX80 in the natural picture profile, as you can see in the clouds of this very demanding scene. I would say the dynamic range of the M10 is okay for most use cases, but nothing special. The colors overall are quite beautiful. I think the saturation is not overdone and you can use it straight out of camera for fast turnarounds. Skin tones are also very pleasing. There are no blotches or weird color shifts, so that's nice to see. I didn't have to do much grading to get the colors where I want them to be to look natural and yet cinematic. Autofocus is very relevant for many shooters out there, and I have to say it's of course a little bit older and it uses older contrast detect autofocus, so it's not on par with modern phase detect systems. It's a bit slow in 4K, but when you move slow enough, it sticks to the subject and finds it reliably. But I would probably use the single AF as push autofocus more often than the continuous autofocus.
Vlogging is not so great on this camera because it doesn't have a mic input, so I would need to use a lavalier mic to get great audio, and also there is no flip out screen, so I can't see the screen while vlogging.
Even though there is no audio input, I found the in-camera audio to be quite good in the vlogging test. So maybe this could work for fast stuff, but if you want to do serious documentary or feature work, you need to record your audio externally. I don't think it's as bad as it sounds. I think it frees the audio section to move more freely, and you have to sync it in post, but that's no problem at all. I didn't mind it on the GX80 and I won't mind it here. It would be nice to have, yes, but it's not the end of the world. So is this a great 4K pocketable cinema camera that outshines the GX80? Well, this camera has a lot going for it. The main features that stand out for me are the different handling, the much better viewfinder and the great IBIS. But on the other hand, the sharpness and dynamic range are a tad worse than on the GX80, and the menu system is really something you need to get used to. For everyone who is an Olympus shooter or likes the form factor and look of an Olympus camera, I think this is a no-brainer. The EM10 Mark III really packs a whole lot of features for its money. If you know what you're doing, you will be very happy with the results of this camera. But let me know in the comments down below what you think. Are there any special features you want me to take a closer look at? Please let me know in the comments down below, and if you like this review, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And I hope you have a nice day and create something extraordinary.